Hi guys, this is Miss Igo. Welcome to my classroom. In this video, we're going to be talking about factoring by grouping. Factoring by grouping is used whenever you have a polynomial with 4 terms that needs to be factored. The first thing we should always look for when factoring is a greatest common factor. So if I look at this polynomial, I notice that the first 3 terms have x's, but not all 4 terms. The first 2 terms are divisible by 2. The last 2 terms are divisible by 3, but there's nothing that all 4 terms are divisible by. So they don't have a greatest common factor. So we factor by grouping, and we do that by grouping the first 2 terms together by putting them in parentheses, leave the sign in the middle, and then group the last 2 terms together. Then we look for a greatest common factor in each group. If you don't know or don't remember how to find the greatest common factor, I'll put a link to my video on how to do so in the description. So if I look at the first group, my greatest common factor is 2x squared. So I'm going to write what's left when I factor out 2x squared. 2x cubed divided by 2x squared would be x, minus 14x squared divided by 2x squared would be 7. Bring down my plus sign, and then when I look at the second group, the greatest common factor is 3. So if I divide the first term by 3, I'm left with x, and the second term would give me a minus 7. Now once I get to this point, the stuff that's in the parentheses should look the same. If it doesn't, that means you did something wrong. So I'm going to pause here for just a minute. And if I had something that looked like this, 2x plus 3x, I would factor out this x because they have that in common. And I would be left with x times 2 plus 3, right? Well, in this group, I have an x minus 7 in common. So these two groups, this group right here and this group right here, they're separated by this plus sign. Okay, so for each of those groups, we have an x minus 7. So now I'm going to factor that out in the same way that I factored the x out of this example up here. So I'm factoring out the x minus 7. Okay, once I factor that out, I'm going to write what I have left, just like up here I wrote the 2x plus the 2 plus 3. Here, what I have left is 2x squared plus 3. And now it's factored. So I could, if you want to check your answer to make sure that you got it right, you could you could multiply these two binomials back together by foiling, and you would end up with what you started with. Now, this answer that I have here, these two binomials, could be written like this instead, 2x squared plus 3 times the x minus 7. So it doesn't matter what order your binomials are in. These two answers are equivalent. All right, let's look at this example. Again, first check to see if there's a greatest common factor in all 4 terms, and there is not. So we group together the first 2 terms, leave our sign in the middle, group together the last 2 terms. Now, in the first group, our greatest common factor would be x. So if I were to divide by x to get what I have left, here, divide by x, and I'm left with a y plus this. When I divide x by x, they don't cancel out and go away. X divided by x is 1. So make sure you put that 1 there because, again, anytime I factor, I should be able to multiply what I factored or my factors back together to get what I started with. So here, if I were to distribute this x, that would give me xy, and then x times 1 is x. If I didn't put a 1 there, I wouldn't be able to get back to where I started with, or what I started with. All right, in the second group, I'll bring down my plus sign. In the second group, what is my greatest common factor? Well, I would say that there's not a greatest common factor, but we have to factor something out. When we're doing this grouping, we have to factor something out, and we can divide both of these terms by 1. So if there's nothing else that we can factor out, you have to take something out, it's going to be a 1. All right, and then if I divide by 1, I have the same thing. Y divided by 1 is y. 1 divided by 1 is 1. All right, and now the stuff that's in my parentheses looks the same. So that's a common factor that they have, and I'm going to factor that out, the y plus 1. And when I factor out y plus 1, what I have left is x plus 1. And that's my answer. Again, if I had written my answer as x plus 1 times y plus 1, that would be okay too. Okay, in this example, again, when we look across, there's not a greatest common factor. So we're going to group together the first two terms and group together the last two terms. Only this time our sign in the middle is a negative. Well, when we have a negative sign in front of a set of parentheses and we want to get rid of the parentheses, we have to distribute that negative into the parentheses. Well, it's the same when we put up parentheses. We have to distribute, or you can think of it as undistributing, that negative sign, which means that when I have a negative sign and I put up parentheses, I need to change the sign between the two terms. So instead of this being a plus, we need to change it to a minus. Okay, so now I'm going to look at the first group and see what they have in common. And the only thing they have in common is x's, and we're going to, when we factor out a variable, we always use the lowest exponent. So x squared is going to be my greatest common factor. And x cubed divided by x squared is x, minus 2x squared divided by x squared would be 2. Bring down my minus sign, and then the greatest common factor between 5x and 10 is 5. If I divide 5x by 5, I'm left with x minus 10 divided by 5 is 2. So if I had not changed this sign whenever I put up my parentheses, then this would have been x minus 2 and this would have been x plus 2. And like I said, if these things in your groups are not the same, that means you did something wrong. So if you notice that your signs are different, then think about whether or not you should have changed the sign when you put up the parentheses. So again, we look to see what they have in common, and it's the x minus 2. And we factor that out. And then we write what's left, which is x squared minus 5. All right, one more example. Again, we're going to look to see if there's a greatest common factor, and here we have one. All of these terms are even, which means they're all divisible by 2. So first I'm going to factor out a 2. And I'm going to use brackets so that later when we start putting up parentheses, we can differentiate the 2. So if I divide every term by 2, I'm left with 3x cubed minus 2x squared minus 6x plus 4. All right, now there's no more greatest common factor, and this 2 is just going to tag along with our answer, and we're going to work the rest of this out just like we've been doing. So we're going to group together the first two terms, leave the sign in the middle, and group together the last two terms. But again, this sign in the middle is a minus, which means we need to change this sign. Now, if this sign had started out as a minus, we would change it to a plus. Whatever it is, you need to change it to the opposite. Okay, so this 2 is going to tag along here. And then in the first group, the greatest common factor is x squared. And so we're left with 3x minus 2. Bring down our minus sign. The greatest common factor between these two terms is 2. So if I divide by 2, I'm left with 3x minus 2. All right. So again, we'll bring this down. Now, when I look at these two terms, or these two groups, this 3x minus 2 is what they have in common. So I'm going to factor that out, 3x minus 2. And then what's left is the x squared minus 2. And so this whole thing, the 2 times 3x minus 2 times x squared minus 2 is my solution. If you like this video, be sure to click the like button below. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Also, if this video helped you, make sure to share it with your classmates. Thank you for watching.